Today's webinar is part of CAPI's third cohort of doctoral fellows. This cohort, made up of Luter Atagher, Melat Adde, Kushank Bajaj, and Maria Carolina Romero Pereira, has focused on the intersection of agriculture, trade, the environment, and food security. In light of recent trade disruptions, food security concerns, and climate change commitments, CAPI is interested in how these issues are impacting Canadian agriculture and agri-food and their policy implications. The research completed by our doctoral fellows has provided CAPI the opportunity to examine how the confluence of policy decisions has an overall impact on these important Canadian agriculture issues. This webinar is the final component of the first 2 years of this fellowship. In their second year, our doctoral fellows will be working to bring their research and ideas together to create a group research paper. Today, our webinar is based on Luter, Melat, Kushank, and Carolina's research and their respective research reports. Before we dive into those reports, we want to extend a special thank you for the support of the RBC Foundation. This fellowship is supported in part by RBC Foundation's RBC Tech For Nature initiative and part of CAPI's larger environmental initiative, Spearheading Sustainable Solutions. CAPI's work is only possible because of the support of partners like RBC. We recently launched our partnership program and value all of our knowledge and financial partners who make our work possible. Please reach out to me or Bree, our Director of Partnerships and Business Development, to talk about becoming a CAPI partner. We'll now hear from each of our doctoral fellows on the research they've recently completed. I will take the opportunity after we've heard from each fellow to ask them some questions to dive further into their work and their policy implications. The final portion of the webinar will be an open discussion where you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function on your screens to submit questions. Currently pursuing his PhD at the Institute for Resource Environment and Sustainability at University of British Columbia, Kushank Bajaj studies food and land use systems, focusing on sustainable and resilient transformations. His PhD research aims to investigate the resilience of food systems to climate change and other shocks. Kushank, over to you.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks for that great introduction. So I'm going to share my screen and talk about the report that I worked on for CAPI. So the report that I worked on investigates Canada's fruits and vegetable supply at subnational scales. It is a first step to understanding vulnerabilities to climate change. As our grandmothers have always told us, fruits and vegetables are an integral part of a healthy diet. In fact, Canada's food guide recommends that half of our plates should consist of fruits and vegetables every day. However, when we look at Canada's food supply or consumption data, we find that fruits and vegetables only constitute a quarter of our food plate currently. A part of the problem, so why look at supply chains or understand fruits and vegetable flows is that Canada's fruits and vegetable supply is extremely import dependent. What we found from our data analyses is that about 80% of all fruits consumed by Canadians are imported, and vegetables, 60% of the vegetables consumed are imported as well. With vegetables, this import dependence has actually been increasing over time. It's increased by roughly 10%. So why is it important is that if there is a certain shock in any of these producing regions that we depend on, those shocks are reverberated into Canada and affects our affordability and access to fruits and vegetables. Just to illustrate or give an illustrative example here, you might remember what happened with lettuce earlier this year and later last year, where the prices of lettuce skyrocketed. A lettuce head was costing about $10 in Eastern Canada. This was all related to pest shocks and droughts happening in California, on which we depend for over 70% of our lettuce supply. So in this report, we try to investigate these food flows, understand where and how much our different fruits and vegetables come from. what we found was very interesting. We found that the import dependence and the interprovincial flows depend very substantially by different provinces. For fruits, we found, for example, Nova Scotia's international import dependence is about 32%, whereas Ontario's international import dependence is whooping 95%. So we're able to see how at provincial scale, these portfolios change and our dependence on international imports vary. Just to give you another example, this is just looking at avocados supply of at provincial scale. On the y-axis, we can see the provinces. Every bar on the graph represents that province on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, we're showing the supply proportion of avocados. And the stack within those bars show us the producing regions that we depend on. So for example, BC, we can see MX is Mexico. Almost BC depends on Mexico for over 80–90% of its consumption. And we can, by doing a time series analysis, we can see how these portfolios have changed over time. For example, in 2010, we had a lot more diversified supply than what we did in 2015 or 16, where we were getting most of our avocados from Mexico. And this changed very recently in the year 2020 and 2022, when there was a shock in from Mexico. So this is just the first step to understanding our supply chain vulnerabilities. And with this data has a lot of policy implications, some of which are, it can help understand how do we build a more resilient supply chains. And some of the policy implications are diversifying our supply chains. This can be done by appraising current and future trade agreements. We could support domestic production by supporting smallholder fruits and vegetable farmers to increase domestic production. We need to also manage media amplification and panic buying. People tend to buy a lot of food when they hear something in the news about, oh, there's going to be a shortage. We also need to support eat local and seasonal food movements, which acts as a leverage to increasing domestic and sustainable food production. We also need to invest in domestic infrastructure. A large share of fruits and vegetables, what our results found, are transported between provinces. And increasing funding for adaptation and climate resilience programs, not just in Canada, but also in regions that we depend on for our fruits and vegetables. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you for that. And again, that's just a brief overview of the research report that you've done. And I would encourage those that are watching, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll pick them up after. Kushank, I want to maybe start by, again, just taking a step back. So you've been looking at supply chain vulnerabilities. This project looked at it at the subnational level, but when you think about COVID, flooding in BC, invasion of Ukraine, supply chain vulnerabilities have been in the news quite regularly. How vulnerable do you think that our fruit and vegetable supplies really are?
Thanks for the question, Tyler. I honestly don't have a simple answer for you. As I mentioned, supply chains or vulnerability of supply chains depend on multiple factors, some of which are how diverse our supply portfolios are. It depends on the media amplification and how that affects panic buying. It also depends on how our traders are able to shift suppliers when there's a shock. And it also depends on how vulnerable these regions are to climate and non-climatic shocks that we depend on. But the high import dependence on fruits for fruits and vegetables and the shorter shelf life of these nutritious food definitely makes our supply chain more vulnerable. And it's also really important to understand, and recognize that each fruit and vegetable supply is unique and their vulnerabilities are going to be unique as well.
And so part of the uniqueness also, your research points out that it's different in each province, where the trade flows are different and their dependence are on kind of cross-border international trade versus intra-provincial trade is different. You know, I think often we think in the government policy context about all provinces are equal, but I think your research shows that that's not actually the case. Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia really serve as supply hubs for fruit and vegetable imports. Can you just talk about what you think the consequences of that are and whether or not we should be, if we want to try and improve the resilience of our fruit and vegetable supply, how we should be taking that into account?
So thanks for that question, Tyler. This was a really interesting finding from the results. When we started looking at the data, we found that there are these supply hubs, as you mentioned, where a lot of fruits and vegetables that enter Canada are cleared by customs, which are likely to move interprovincially, which is also not surprising just based on where these supply hubs are located in relative to the producing regions, but also the large seaports that we are located in these provinces. We also, about 80% of all fruit and vegetable processing plants are based in these provinces. And the example that you gave earlier as well about the BC flooding, it's really, that was a great sort of a shock that showed us the vulnerabilities of our supply chains and why Alberta needs to think about BC's transportation infrastructure as well. With the atmospheric river event in 2021, that destroyed a lot of highways, blocking most of the both by road and railway networks to Alberta and the Prairie provinces, which has had implications for both food going in and out of the provinces. So in short, I think there needs to be more collaboration between provinces and more strategic investments in these supply hubs.
Great. And just on that, again, I think one of the things that came up in the BC context was actually BC's international supply chains weren't impacted the same way by that infrastructure disruption. Again, I think it pointed out to some of the challenges around the need to boost domestic supply, but also the need to also rely on more diversified imports and to really boost resilience. Can you just maybe speak to how do you see that balance? Is it your recommendations touch on both of them, but what role does increasing domestic supply play versus diversifying our import base?
There is always a trade-off between resiliency and sustainability, or managing our emissions or environmental sustainability. We see this almost every day in our life. Just to give you an example, and going a little off track here, while I was working with farmers in the semi-arid region of India, we struggled with the same issue where, on one hand, to build resilience, you had to increase irrigation and access to water for farmers in the semi-arid dry regions. But at the same time, that was leading to unsustainable use of groundwater and unsustainable extraction of groundwater. So how do you, it's this that tension, and trying to understand that there's always going to be a trade-off really helps in the interventions or the policies we decide on. So in that context, what the organization used to do was try and focus on interventions that were both supply and demand driven. So we were, yes, helping farmers increase their resilience, but also helping them recharge groundwater or reduce their, or shift to less water intensive crops. Similarly, in Canada's case, I think fruits and vegetables only have a very small proportion of emissions in the whole food sector. So increasing the production, domestic production of fruits and vegetables should, especially knowing that it has are extremely nutritious foods, it's just a small trade-off.
Great. Well, thank you, Kushank. And that trade-off is a good segue into our next presentation this morning. So we'll hear now from Carolina. Carolina graduated as a civil engineer from Pontificia Universidad Javierna in Colombia. She holds a master's in environmental engineering and project management from the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, and is currently a PhD student in sustainability management at the University of Waterloo. With food security at the core of sustainability, her research lies in sustainability applied to the agri-food sector, motivated by a desire to provide tools for reducing adverse effects of food systems on the environment and ensuring food security without sacrificing nutritional value. Carolina, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Tyler. And I think this was a great introduction to my team, because undoubtedly we need to find ways of increasing the resilience of food systems in countries like Canada. Vertical farming is a type of indoor farming, and what makes it different from other types of indoor farming is that they have vertical configurations, either in multiple levels or towers or spirals. They're highly controlled environment, and they are also technology based. So this study was intended to analyze the opportunities and challenges of vertical farming to contribute to more sustainable food systems in Canada, for which I performed a literature review on existing studies addressing the sustainability of vertical farming as components of food systems. And I guided this literature review with the sustainability compass to address all areas of concern in the sustainability of food systems. Then I performed a review of strategic documents in Canada to understand the priorities and perspectives of food systems in Canada, of the sustainability of food systems in Canada facing the future. And then I performed an analysis integrating the results of these two stages. So from the review of literature, most studies addressing the sustainability of vertical farming and of their contribution to the sustainability of food systems are based on the review of literature. Some studies provide information on their performance for specific sustainability-related topics, and there is a reduced group of studies that address their sustainability with systems thinking, with life cycle assessment, addressing one or two dimensions of sustainability. And the results of these studies apply to very specific configurations and locations of vertical farming. So one of the main findings of my study is that the sustainability performance of vertical farming depend on multiple factors, engineering factors, plant science factors, technologies used, and also management factors, where I would like to highlight two key factors, which are the types of crops produced in vertical farming and the potential markets, because these define the performance, the environmental performance, also social and economic performance, and the profitability, and therefore the viability of these types of technologies. Here, I have an example of the energy intensity of vertical farming for different types of crops, and you can see like three big groups of performance in terms of energy intensity for wheat, potato, and lettuce. In this case, for this study of wheat, the difference, the range, was due to the assumption of different technologies, right? So it depends on how efficient and modern the technologies used are to produce crops in vertical farming. And if we go to a single type of production, for instance, producing lettuce, we will find that for different locations, the performance of vertical farming in terms of energy intensity is relatively consistent for different temperatures, humidity conditions, and different regions. Whereas for greenhouses, for instance, there are some fluctuations because they are not completely controlled environments as vertical farming is. So the opportunities and challenges of vertical farming are relative to multiple factors. For instance, if you want to obtain a free farm area, this will depend on factors such as the type of energy used. Are we using off-grid solar PV energy? So we need to account this land use to see if we obtain free farm area. We want to reduce greenhouse gases, so that depends on the sources of energy. Here we have three examples of energy grids in Ontario, Nova Scotia, and Quebec. So the energy sources will define the greenhouse gases related to producing crops in vertical farming. And also that will depend on whether we consider or not externalities, greenhouse gases domestically or across the lifespan of crop production. There are also trade-offs among the areas of concern in the sustainability of food systems. For instance, by implementing technologies such as vertical farming, we may reduce the vulnerability related to the dependence on imports, like Kushank was just describing, but then we may have increased vulnerability due to the dependence on inputs such as energy, fertilizer, seeds, materials. We need to ensure continuity in these inputs, otherwise we will have, again, vulnerable food systems. And this is only one example of the multiple trade-offs among areas of concern in sustainability of food systems that must be considered in addressing this, the contribution of these types of technologies. So further research and multi-stakeholder dialogues are required, and this must consider clear definition of the desired outcomes of sustainable food systems in Canada. We want to reduce the dependence on imports. We want to increase the capacity for exports. We want to reduce domestic greenhouse gases or global greenhouse gases. That will be an important consideration. Clear definition of the purpose of implementing vertical farming in each region in Canada. Clear definition of the types of crops and intended markets. This is crucial because if we have a big venue that is energy intensive with a big investment just for producing lettuce, and we don't have a market for that, then we won't have a feasible project. And further research and planning should consider multifunctionality. This would be one of my main recommendations, and I would say policy implications, because these venues require aligning the needs for supplying fruits and vegetables in each region. And these technologies must be envisioned with a lens of multifunctionality, not only producing lettuce, but producing other types of crops and maybe offering other services and establishing synergies with other businesses, local businesses. So can vertical farming be part of more sustainable food systems in Canada? There is no singular answer for this. This depends on multiple factors. Trade-offs among sustainability aims must be considered, and their potential contribution to more sustainable food systems in Canada may be a matter of proper planning, further research, and sustainability management. Canada, I believe, could become leader in making vertical farming a sustainable solution with more research in this matter. Thank you.
Great, and thank you for that presentation. And again, I think it shows the good continuity between the different research projects. I'm going to come back to the issue of trade-offs that are really important, but I want to start by kind of this really simple question around sustainability. I think often people think about vertical farming as the future of food. It certainly gets a lot of media attention. But you talked at the end about how do we make vertical farming part of a sustainable food system in the future. I was wondering if you could talk about, again, a little bit more about what's needed there, and you highlight the need for multifunctionality. Can you give some examples of what that really means in practice and what we should be doing to embrace that in the Canadian context?
Yes, Tyler. So one of the things that I found is that the performance of vertical farming across the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainability varies depending on the context, on the conditions, on energy sources, on technologies used, on types of crops produced. It varies greatly depending on multiple conditions. So there is no yes or no answer. It's relative to each case. And I found that most research on vertical farming, most of that, is based on the production of of tomatoes and lettuce, leafy greens and tomatoes. But then when I speak about multifunctionality, what I try to do is, or what my main message is, that the profitability and viability of vertical farming also depends on the marketability of the produce. So if you go to a region and you have a big investment in one of these venues, you need to make sure that you're producing the type of crops that the region needs. Or if you want to export, or if you want to reduce imports, you need to match this need of the markets with the produce from vertical farming. So multifunctionality is about not only producing leafy greens, but also for the research to produce different types of fruits, different types of vegetables. Why not offering different services, maybe for learning, maybe for involving communities in this production. It's not only about producing a single type of crop. So there will be trade-offs among sustainability aims, Tyler. And I believe this is not only about reducing domestic CO2 emissions, because this is a way of addressing, but then if you consider the emissions across the lifespan of a crop, you will find many variables to consider. So it's not only about producing locally, it's not only about the emissions related to the imports of crops, but also the emissions related to the energy uptake in both systems, conventional and vertical farming. Crop production in fields, for instance, require machinery, and this requires fossil fuels, whereas vertical farming requires electricity, and the CO2 emissions will depend on the sources of electricity that you use to produce, but you will also have some inputs. You need seeds, you need fertilizers, you need other materials, growth media, and you will have some transport processes and production processes related to this material. So a life cycle perspective is crucial here to really analyze the potential contribution of these systems to sustainability.
And so that life cycle assessment, I think, seems easier when we're thinking about a vertical farming context where you can really easily measure and assess the inputs and the impacts. But what lessons have you learned looking at these life cycle assessments of vertical farming that can be applied to other sectors outside of vertical farming, traditional agriculture production, whether it be producing eggs or growing wheat or canola?
Well, what I would say, Tyler, is that it's not all about CO2 emissions. There are many things to consider, right? It's also about viability, affordability, healthier diets, logistics, ecosystems, and human health. So what I noticed is that most life cycle assessment studies are focused or emphasize on CO2 emissions, but there are also other things to consider. For instance, one of the reasons why I'm so interested in vertical farming is because they provide the possibility of producing crops without pesticides. And from the perspective of human health, I believe this is very important. And most assessments don't really allow considering this use phase in the assessment. So I would say one of the challenges of life cycle assessments for food systems facing the future, for not only for crop production, but as you say, for meat production, for dairy production, and other types of production, is considering the impacts on human health, not only limited to what happens to domestic CO2 emissions, but what happens with other areas of sustainability that are very important to consider.
Great. Thank you. And I think we'll pick up on some of those points in the group discussion as well. And so we'll go on to our next presentation this morning. It's from Melat Adde. Adde is a PhD candidate in the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research focuses on agriculture innovations and agri-food supply chains. Her current PhD research applies experimental and behavioral economics to explore the pathways and impediments to the adoption of new agriculture technology. Melat, over to you.
Thank you, Tyler. Share my screen. Yeah, so my research is about leveraging behavioral insights for effective technology adoption policies. So right now, there's increasing attention being given to producing food in an environmentally responsible, socially equitable, and economically viable way. And Canada is a leader a leader in sustainable farming practices, and adoption of these sustainable practices is increasing throughout the country, but it's different. The adoption rate is different among throughout the country based on climate, soil type, or crop type, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach to this, and there needs to be flexibility and support to adjust policies and programs for regional farm operations. So the report aimed to understand why a voluntary program aimed at reducing emissions from fertilizer was perceived as a fertilizer ban, mandatory and unattainable, and how effective communication and engagement would reduce resistance in such programs and increase collaboration, which can obviously lead to success in such voluntary programs. And the report uses behavioral insights, which draw from various fields, including economics and psychology, to understand how people behave and make decisions to inform and improve policy design and outcomes. And some of the behavioral insights discussed in the report include effective framing. So people are more sensitive. We are more sensitive to losses than gains. We are willing to exert more effort to avoid losing $20 than gaining $20. So we are more sensitive to losing. So framing adoption programs or policies as avoiding losses and emphasizing the loss from failure to adapt can be more effective in terms of uptake of programs and information. Having a relevant, reliable, and clear information has been found to be one of the most important aspects for the adoption decisions. And a lot of surveys have been done, and a common trend of this, I think, through every country and every region and for every type of technology adoption is relevant, clear access to information. So making sure information is communicated in a clear way is very important, and also the source of that information, who communicates that information, impacts the perception of the program as well as the action producers are willing to take. For example, in an experiment done with 12,000 producers in the States, found that it was a recruitment, and recruitment was 50% higher when the messenger was from a known university rather than from a less widely known agricultural research center. So in some regions, there is a wide acceptability of maybe research institutes or universities. So utilizing that and making sure information comes from a reliable source and widely accepted sources important, and early engagement of producers in the designing of the policy or in research and demonstration plots is also important, as it reduces risk, uncertainty, and also helps with getting that information clearly is important. And another behavioral insight that can be used in designing policies and programs is norms. So research has shown that social pressure, whether it's approval or disapproval, can motivate action, and particularly it's useful for voluntary programs. In a research done among households to see how to reduce water use during drought. So there was an experiment run where different letters, different information was sent out to different people. One group received information on how to reduce water. Another group received personalized letter asking them to reduce water use. Another group received a letter informing them how their water use compares to others in that community, in that region. And another group received no information. And the result of the study found that social comparison, the third group, which had information comparing their use with others, had the highest and most persistent effect on decreasing water use, and the impacts can be detected 6 years later. So we can use that social pressure, what the community believes in communicating that, and can motivate action. And another behavioral insight we can use is the how to address resistance to change. Change is always hard. We don't really want to change, so change is hard. So promoting small incremental changes and gradual exposure to issues can produce better results than having a big announcement and significant change all at once. So the policy implications from this report is policymakers can use behavioral insights to improve policy design, given, of course, it makes economic sense, it makes ecologic sense, and all that is in place. Behavioral insights can provide a comprehensive understanding of issues, particularly in how people make decisions. So it can be used to the development of better policies and programs. And it's also important to test the effectiveness of framing strategies or policies and review them based on the results that we have obtained, so as to increase program participation and uptake and have a continuous persistent participation in programs. So that's my report. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you for that overview. So I want to pick up on a couple of points, and the first is really around this focus on how do we get farmers to farm more sustainably. When we look at a lot of the focus out of policymakers in Canada, today it's really around financial incentives for BMPs. For example, the federal government is investing heavily in better nitrogen management and more intensive grazing. But your paper looks at how a lot of the measures to get farmers to improve farm or to do things differently may need to go beyond financial incentives and may think about things like better engagement, more effective communications. I want to start by asking, do you think Canada's finding the right balance between engagement and communication with producers and offering financial incentives, and how do we are we doing both well?
Yeah. So as I've said in the presentation, the top reasons farmers hesitate to adopt sustainable agricultural practices is because of lack of financial resources, economic incentives, and reliable information. So, to get farmers to try sustainable farming, of course, economic incentives are vital. However, the politicization of climate change can lead to unrepresentative environmental policies, and environmental policies can solely focus on the problem in the environment and not and demand all farmers to make sweeping changes that may not actually work for each region. So while financial incentives can be effective in encouraging farmers, it might not be the only that may not always address the underlying barriers or create long-term behavioral changes. So that's why a focus on engagement is important to identify those real barriers that are other than the economics one. And I think Canada is finding the right balance between the two, though there definitely are areas for improvement. One example being the communication of the emission reduction from fertilizer plant being, but there are also some good examples where engagement and incentives were communicated. For example, the environmental farm plan, alternative land use services, the sustainable agriculture stewardship program. So I think these programs were developed with partnership with producers, and they were also providing financial support. So the balance is important, and I think Canada is doing well, but there obviously is some room for improvement.
Great. And do you see much experiment? Again, I thought it was interesting the study that was done in the United States around water use and trying to offer producers different types of information. But do you see much experimentation around behavioral practices and getting farmers to change in Canada, or do you see much outside of the academic context?
Well, I'm most familiar with the academic context, but I think most of the research is being done in the States, but there is like Ontario and BC have their own behavioral insight unit. So there is some research being done, though even at the federal level, there is a unit that's using behavioral insight, but those are used for priority areas, and I haven't seen much experiment, at least that are published in the agriculture center, but I think it's a growing field, and it can be used heavily in the agriculture setting in Canada, but I haven't seen much. I'm sure there are some studies, but they aren't as widely being used as in the States.
Okay, and a lot of the time, this gets boiled down, simplified to should we be using a carrot or a stick? What drives the most change? Is it a financial incentive or a regulatory tool, regulatory approach? Based on your research to date, which do you think actually works better? What's necessary to get better results from farmers at the end of the day?
Yeah, I don't think there is like one size fits all approach to any policy or program. Some programs require regulation, particularly if it's related to safety, and some others are based performance or incentives like voluntary participation. So it all depends on the type of program on the issue. But effective communication and engagement and behavioral insights are something that can be applicable to both regulatory and also incentives. And I believe most environmental programs should be voluntary ones where they are incentivized to ensure continuity and collaboration throughout the long term. However, as we have been discussing, even when the incentives are there, people are like hesitant to adapt. Some participation in programs is low, even though there is like the economic incentive. So one potential important factor contributing to low adoption rates, I think, is the marketing and design of programs. They may not be addressing the key players or the key issue. So if it doesn't make sense environmentally, it doesn't work for the region, for the climate, for the crop, and no amount of providing carrots is going to work, no amount of economic support is going to work. So it's important to understand the dynamics in the context so as to provide the correct correct carrot and the correct incentive. So where behavioral insights come in is that it helps you identify those and seize that opportunity and apply it. So I think more than whether it's a stick or a carrot, what matters is how the carrot is provided and whether it's the correct type of incentive. So I think once we identify, particularly for such adoption of sustainable practices that happen on an individual farm, I think the carrot approach is better if done correctly.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and it certainly speaks to, I think, the need for more innovative program design. I think sometimes in agriculture in particular, we get a set of programs and they stay around and they tend to do the same thing. But I think your research points to different tools and different ways to better reflect and engage that. I was wondering, maybe just quickly, do you think that, are we doing well incorporating these behavioral insights? Are we innovating in program design in Canada?
Yeah, I think we are doing good, but there is room for improvement. We can definitely do better, especially there are like cost-effective ways that behavioral insights are cost-effective ways. Before having a large-scale program, we can do a contour mandate, a pilot program, have some program and design it differently, maybe adjust the incentive or make one regulatory or the other incentive and try it out in the community. Just take one community, take two communities that are similar, then give those both information so we can get real-time data like real-time data and see which one has a better reception rate, which one has some issues, engage with the community. And once that is done, you can have a large-scale implementation of that program. So I think there is potential in there that Canada can do, and there is room for improvement. But I think we are on the right track. There is increasing use of this in Canada. So
great, thank you. Yeah, we often talk about innovation in agriculture. Innovation and program design is something that we shouldn't forget about too. So thank you, Melat, and we'll go on to our last presentation this morning. Luter is a doctoral candidate at the Faculty of Law at McGill University. His research focuses on the intersection of international trade law and environmental protection. His thesis explores the process by which member states of the World Trade Organization are carving out widening regulatory autonomy beyond the perceived confines of WTO jurisprudence to adopt trade policy measures that have environmental protection objectives. The project examines the significance of all of these developments for the border carbon adjustment proposals. So Luter, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Tyler. Hello, everyone. I'll share my screen and begin my presentation. So my report was on the application of border carbon adjustments to international fertilizer trade, and I'm looking specifically at the legal challenges and options for progress. Now, how did we get to border carbon adjustment? First of all, carbon pricing, and that's what border carbon adjustment is. Current carbon pricing mechanisms are restricted to domestic product as a matter of territorial jurisdiction of the state that are regulating for environmental protection. However, this leads to a free rider problem known as carbon leakage, by which goods that are produced unsustainably in jurisdictions that do not have carbon prices derive a competitive benefit or competitive advantage in international trade. And because goods produced in jurisdictions that are priced, that have carbon prices compete with goods that do not have carbon prices, then goods that are produced unsustainably get that benefit in terms of cost. They become affordable and have a competitive advantage. Also, there is a risk of relocation of industries to those jurisdictions to derive that wider margin in production. And what this does is that it rewards unsustainable production and also undermines the climate action of states that trying to address emissions through carbon pricing, because most emissions, emissions that occur everywhere have a global impact. Then what BCA's border carbon adjustment seeks to do in this case is to simply extend similar treatment of given to domestic products under carbon pricing in various countries to imports coming into those countries. And what this does is that it seeks to level the carbon playing field, which is the technical term, by ensuring that both imports and domestic products face the same carbon price. So that way there is no competitive advantage from unsustainable production. And this also rewards sustainable production because products that are produced in more sustainable processes get to face less cost of carbon pricing. Now, countries that are introducing border carbon adjustments will find some support from various international legal instruments. First of all, there are soft legal instruments like the Rio Declaration, which expresses the commitment of states to internalize environmental costs associated with production, also known as the polluter pays principle. However, this is also made subject to non-discussion of international trade and investment. So when states take these measures, they have to ensure that trade is not distorted. And that immediately creates, two conflicting interests that have to be balanced. Much of this balance occurs under WTO law, and under the WTO, Article 2 and 3 of the GATT actually provides some leeway for states to adopt what is called border tax adjustment. What it means is that states can extend to foreign goods imported into their jurisdiction the same internal taxes or charges or regulatory measures that are applicable to domestic products. Now, originally, this was done to ensure that there is domestic stability by extending the same fiscal treatment, but the provisions in the GATT are broad enough to accommodate different forms of taxes or charges, including the two different types of border carbon adjustments that we have, and that is the extension of the domestic carbon tax or the extension of the regulatory treatment under an emissions trading scheme. So the destination principle, as it is called, that is reserving to the country of destination, the country that imports products, the jurisdiction to apply the internal taxes in its jurisdiction, does that. And that also gives the state, the country of origin, from where the goods emanate into the international market, the flexibility to choose whether it will provide rebates with respect to its own internal taxes, including internal carbon prices. But this is also subject to the requirement under the GATT that there is non-discrimination. In other words, the border carbon adjustments or border tax adjustments more broadly need to be need to mirror the exact same treatment or as approximately close as possible in terms of structure, in terms of price, in terms of application to that which is obtainable in the domestic market. And also there's a requirement that these should not be applied in an arbitrary manner. Then free trade agreements also support the adoption of border carbon adjustment, basically in the form of provisions that allow states to adopt ambitious climate change policies. Many of these free trade agreements, especially the ones to which Canada is signatory, have elaborate provisions that provide for the right of states to pursue various levels, high levels of environmental protection that is encouraged, and this can provide the basis for the legal basis for support for the carbon adjustments. But there are expectations that whatever measures that are taken satisfy the requirements of transparency and cooperation. Various mechanisms exist under the free trade agreements for signatory states to cooperate in the adoption of these measures. Now, in terms of its broader context, border carbon adjustment, especially when it's applicable to international fertilizer trade, has certain costs and benefits. In terms of cost, this literally means additional cost of fertilizer because various inputs. Take Canada, for example, which has recently imported fertilizer from various sources, including countries like Morocco, Algeria, and still a large chunk of Canadian fertilizers comes from the US. But the cheaper option in the market that provide competition in the local market means that those prices are likely to get an increase as a result of the application of border carbon adjustment in Canada if it were to be implemented within the country. And this also means lower margin for fertilizer producers and farmers who have to bear the cost, and that presents a risk of cost pass-through to farmers and down to consumers because farmers and producers would struggle to reduce margins and thereby pass the cost on to consumers, and that would actually have the implication of aggravating the global food crisis that we currently face in the light of inflation today. But there are benefits. Example, within Canada, for instance, if Canada were to adopt the border carbon adjustment, that means that the disadvantages that local producers suffer in terms of facing a carbon price, whereas imports do not, is closed. Then in export markets, for instance, if Canada exports to the US or the EU, for instance, then that means that the benefits that other imports into those markets derive from not having a carbon price is closed because they will all face a carbon price. Canada does have a carbon price, and that is rising. I think by 2030 or 2034, we can expect that it might be close to that of the EU. And so the disadvantage that Canada suffers in those export markets will be reduced. And this will have the benefit for sustainable production of fertilizer, which is one of the highest emissions industry in the agricultural sector. If many companies are to adopt sustainable production measures, that would also lower global emissions in general. Now, the key challenge for policymakers becomes how to maximize the benefits while minimizing the cost. This has to be done in order to ensure that we're not thinking in silos and that we're actually taking a broad and all-encompassing approach to addressing climate change while paying attention to the implication of those measures to other issues, including global food security. And the best outcome to achieve this would be to toe the line of diplomacy and as much as possible minimize disputes that may end up becoming sources of litigation. And this can be hefty, literally like a plant shifting through concrete, but actually it's feasible. And we've shown in the past that we can do this in relation to addressing environmental challenges. A good example was the success of the Montreal Protocol in reducing the substances that lead to ozone depletion. So more diplomacy, more discussions among trading partners, among stakeholders will build the confidence of various countries and stakeholders that are currently hesitant to the issue of border carbon adjustment to address those issues and to develop some broad shared understanding. We also need support for innovation in sustainable fertilizer production to enable transition by fertilizer companies operating in Canada. That would help significantly and minimize the cost pass-through. One of those sources of support would be in terms of, let's say, below market interest rate loans, for instance, to ensure that these companies are able to adopt new, clean fertilizer production technology. There are examples of this development happening elsewhere. They have been scaled up right now, I think, by Yari in Norway. Nutrien is doing something in Los Angeles for clean fertilizer production. And a startup in the UK called Neum recently also adopted, is pursuing the same technology. It will be interesting to see that kind of development here in Canada as well. Then, as a last resort, areas of discriminatory treatment in relation to border carbon adjustment adopted by trading partners of Canada need to be monitored to pursue litigation to address those issues as a last resort if discussion fails. Canada is a major trading partner of both the US and the EU, which are the leading countries that have adopted border carbon adjustment. So EU has adopted, the US is constituting strongly in Parliament, both in Congress and also through a new measure by the Department of Commerce. And Canada can leverage its free trade agreements with both the EU and the US to make sure that there is cooperation to address these issues in relation to border carbon adjustment. So thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this, and I look forward to addressing questions.
Yeah, thank you. And Luter, I want to start my question by picking up on that US-EU theme and Canada's the free trade agreements we have, but the US and the EU are really trying to write the ground rules for border carbon adjustments. But if you look at some of the news reports lately about the discussions around the US-EU sustainable steel, TRQ, and this need to try and create a common definition around what does low carbon mean in the steel and aluminum context, the need for some equivalence around the costs of carbon that are put in place. It seems like it's easier said than done. I'm curious around, if you look at again that debate playing out between the US and the EU and the differences in approaches that they have, let alone trying to do something with China and India. How do you think that we get around this barrier of different approaches and different policies and needing to try and find a common way to measure and define the cost of carbon that's put in place in domestic markets?
Right. Thank you, Tyler. So that's an issue of standardization, and it's generally always a very contentious issue, but the contentions are always necessary in order to make headway to find common ground eventually. It was similar with the adoption in the agricultural sector, for instance, of the Codex Alimentarius. Various countries had different diverse ways of measuring food safety before countries finally circled around and decided to adopt something that was cognizable amongst themselves in international trade. So I think these disputes, current differences, actually the challenge that is necessary to make headway, and it can actually be seen as an opportunity to then begin to have conversation to address that. Now, the harmonization can be a long evolutionary process, so we would have to be patient, but we would have to be persistent as well to make sure that there's cooperation. It would take the leadership of international organizations like the WTO, the UNFCCC, for instance, to develop platforms for convergence of a common standard of measurement of what emissions are and what the standards of accounting of these emissions. And then not just efforts by government, but also stakeholders. A lot of these standards can actually be industry specific. And we can look to the International Fertilizer Association, for instance, to come up with an industry specific standard for measuring fertilizer. In the end, convergence can be through, drawing from, as a matter of best practice from different sources of standardization, and then coming up with something that many countries agree with. But we're already seeing a lot of those efforts, and it can actually, if we end up having something that is widely accepted, then it becomes easier for countries like China, India, other high emission countries, even developing countries who are currently hesitant to sign up to the kind of common standard.
Great. And so your paper looks at the border carbon adjustment in the context of fertilizer. Do you think that some form of border carbon adjustment measure is in the future for agriculture and food more broadly? Do you expect, canola or pork exports may one day have to deal with a border carbon adjustment, or is this really for bigger, more energy intensive sectors than agriculture?
Oh, yes. So in terms of its application to sectors like food and food commodities, I think it should depend on what happens internally within different countries. So if within different countries, carbon prices are extended to food and food products, then there is likelihood that there will be pressure for border carbon adjustments to be extended internationally to food and food products. But the likelihood of carbon pricing being extended to domestic food production also depends on various competing pressures. First, environmentalists, for instance, the more they put pressure on governments to introduce regulations for carbon emissions emanating from food production, then the more there is that governments may respond to that kind of pressure by introducing a carbon price to address the emissions associated with agriculture. And when this happens, then we can see that those food producers who face that carbon price locally would then put pressure on the government to introduce border carbon adjustments to level the carbon playing field, but also their consumers. So government may also respond to pressure from consumers as a result of the sensitivity of carbon pricing on food affordability. And if they respond to that, then we're likely to see carbon pricing extended to food products and therefore border carbon adjustments to similar products. And we can see that government is paying attention to that. In Canada, for instance, there is currently Bill C-234 before Parliament seeking to exempt farm production from various aspects of carbon pricing within Canada, for instance, propane and natural gas use for various farm activities like drying grain and irrigation and feed preparation. The EU last year also amended its emissions trading scheme. It had the opportunity to expand that scheme to introduce food, but the government, the EU, did pay attention to the sensitivities around agriculture and decided not to extend the ETS directly. So it would depend on what happens locally. But at the same time, the indirect cost of carbon pricing through sectors like even all the way to steel production, fertilizer, a lot of costs can be passed through all the way down that may affect farmers and therefore affect food prices. Steel, for instance, is necessary for the production of farm equipment and certain aspects of construction of farm facilities, and then fertilizer, which is a direct farming input. So those costs are not to be underestimated, and even though it will be indirect, it will be nonetheless significant.
Great, thank you. And so we'll come back to some questions, and so we'll bring the other doctoral fellows into the Q&A. We've got some questions from our audience for each one of you individually, but I want to start with a group question and encourage you all to participate. And maybe we'll start with Kushank to answer, but then give everyone a turn. And again, I think, this is our intent with this cohort of doctoral fellows was really to look at this intersection around sustainability, trade, food security. Really, it touches, pretty well everything that we do in agriculture and food today. But I think that we sometimes struggle to look at how do we incorporate all of these different dynamics into the policy debate that we have. So if, think just about your presentations this morning, go back to that border carbon adjustment. Should we be exempting food because, a border carbon measure could make food more expensive? Should we be supporting vertical farming because, it addresses resiliency, even though it may have an impact around environmental sustainability? These are just a couple of examples that play out at a really large level when we think about these intersections in Canada. Kushank, starting with you, how easy is it do you think that we do a good job understanding these different dynamics, looking at the trade-offs, being able to measure impacts across all of these, food security, sustainability, trade? Do we have the tools that we need to have a sophisticated policy debate in Canada?
I think we're at a good start. It's as you said, Tyler, it's an extremely complex topic and intersection, and there's going to be always trade-offs and context specificities of any intervention that we decide to work on or implement. It's going to require a lot more discussion. It's going to require a lot more collaboration across different sectors and fields, different stakeholders. But I think we're at a really good start. We're getting there. And Canada, and just to add one more thing to that response is that with the changing climate, Canada also has some advantage over the other regions as well, especially for fruits and vegetables. For example, we're going to see a lot more longer growing seasons. We're going to see more land being able to that we can use towards agriculture and fruits and vegetable production. We're going to see we're going to see extremes like what's happening in BC, northern BC right now, but it's going to be less extreme than other parts of the world. So we have that competitive advantage in some ways, but we do need to work on our domestic infrastructure, for example, or increase the competitiveness of our products. So again, it's more like a complex picture, as most of my answers has been, not a simple answer, but yeah.
And so, Melat, your research talks about how important it is to have clear, effective communications, but Kushank just talked about how complex these issues actually are. How do you think that, if we're going to leverage that work, if we're going to talk to farmers, talk to the sector as a whole about this very dynamic, complex issue, how much more difficult does that make the need to have simple communications?
Yeah, so I think the very fact that we are having this conversation is, I think, important. Realizing the need, realizing that it's a complex and the need for the intersection, the interdisciplinary approach is like a significant work towards addressing such complex issues. So the fact that we are having discussions, there is increasing attention being given to how agriculture policy or how trade policy affects agriculture, and all that is important. So I think, as you said, having that clear communication and continuous engagement helps us identify areas where we obviously we can't intervene in everything, like we can't address everything, but having that open communication and engagement helps us identify the most important thing, the thing that would work for everybody. So I think it helps it simplify, and it helps you narrow down on one aspect and agree and compromise on some areas and achieve one aim. So that's important.
Right, thank you. And Carolina, again, what are your thoughts on this nexus? Again, your research really explicitly looks at the trade-offs and trying to capture that full life cycle assessment. Again, how well do you think that we're doing in looking at all of these different dynamics in our food system in Canada?
So Tyler, one of the things I noticed when I was reviewing the strategic documents in Canada facing the sustainability of food systems is that, and this happens all around the world, we tend to want to envision everything. So we want food systems to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We want them to reduce water use, to provide more opportunities for people to take part of the economy. We want them to be like everything, like a solution for everything. And I think one of the key matters of these conversations, of these multi-stakeholder conversations, is understanding that each solution will have trade-offs and there will be sacrifices. As I said, we want to produce locally, which is good, from the perspective of reducing the vulnerability to disruptions. The world has been facing multiple disruptions, and our food systems need to be transformed, right, to adapt to the changes and to the disruptions that have been going on. There have been shortages of fertilizers. There is a war. There have been shortages and issues with containers that affected the trade worldwide, wildfires, floodings, biologic hazards. I mean, there are disruptions, and we need to think of backup technologies to enhance the resilience of our food systems. But there will be trade-offs. So some people may say, well, I prefer nature-based solutions, and vertical farming are artificial. Well, that is right. But some people may prefer, like myself, to access food with less pesticides, because I believe this is a big issue in the long run to our for our health and for ecosystems. And I believe this is an advantage that we may produce crops, reducing the need for pesticides and agrochemicals. So these are discussions that we need to take. And at the policy level, we need to prioritize and we need to make decisions. There won't be solutions that address everything in a great manner. There will be trade-offs. And we may need to say, okay, so if we produce locally, we're going to increase the domestic CO2 emissions, of course, because we're not outsourcing these emissions to other countries, but we will have these advantages. We will have more food security. We will have these trade-offs in a positive manner. That would be my approach.
And so I just want to come back to Kushank on that trade-offs piece and the domestic food security. And Kushank, how much of that how do you think about that in the context of kind of your research that really looks at supply vulnerability and our resiliency of our systems? But again, you allude in your research to the fact that some of that may likely increase our domestic emissions. So how do you evaluate kind of supply chain resiliency versus environmental emissions? Is there a good way to find that balance?
Okay, let me start by saying that Canada's emissions in the food sector, and especially in the production side, are mostly from cereal crops, oil crops, and beef. And also, there was a recent study that showed that Canada eats less than it emits. So most of our emissions are going from food production are exported in a way. I think the one opportunity is to Canada, being a high-income country, has a lot of resources and research capacities to invest in increasing our efficiencies. So we could increase our efficiencies, find ways to produce fruits and vegetables which are low emission intensive. So I think that would be a key challenge, key intervention or way to manage our resilience and sustainability. And we can, sorry, go on.
No, so I was just going to pick up on your comment about emissions intensity, because I think that that's something that we sometimes struggle with in the Canadian context. And I was wondering, Nute, is there a way to think about, should we be thinking more about emissions intensity if we're thinking about border carbon adjustments as ways to create that level playing field from fertilizer produced in Canada versus fertilizer produced in Russia? And would that apply again in the food context, where we're trying to really understand what is that emissions footprint of a particular product and how does it compare in different countries?
Yeah, I think the emissions intensity of the industry would be important. The challenge is how to define that, what exactly it means. the scope of what we're taking into consideration. One of the popular benchmarks has been energy, but that is only restrictive and, as far as it applies to certain industries. For fertilizer production, for instance, as we know, it's not just energy. The Haber-Bosch process, which is currently in use, is also a high emissions intensive process. So we're looking at both energy and the actual production process. Current water carbon adjustments mechanisms try to address them in terms of both direct and indirect emissions. So that is quite broadly covered. And the second aspect of emissions intensity is that countries, and I think they have, at least for starters, and I think they've done the right thing, selected the industries that have the highest emission, per sector to start with, only at the starting point. I think that's a good way to start because if you begin at a very broad scale, then you risk having another version of inflation that may be hard to manage, and that might end up defeating the entire policy, including any form of climate action. So beginning with these huge industries helps. The good thing about it is that these industries are also huge producers, that they're likely to have, in terms of resources, more options to leverage to start a transition. And they can also be very useful case studies for how carbon pricing can be a successful way of ensuring transition to more sustainable processes of production. So I think it's a matter, but over time we will these issues will evolve. Different countries are adopting these mechanisms in different ways, and there will be consensus of what we should take into account and what we shouldn't.
Great, thank you. And again, for those that are watching, if you've got questions for specific fellows, please, I think most have been good putting them in the questions, but if we don't get to them today, we'll try and follow up quickly after and get back to you with answers. A question for the group, and Carolina, maybe I will start with you first on this. When you look at the work that the other fellows in the cohort have done, are there pieces, themes that have surprised you, or that are common to kind of the work that you're doing that I think point to this nexus between food security, trade, and sustainability?
Yes, Tyler, I was surprised to see how aligned our work is without trying. We didn't try speak to each other and try to make it align. It is just naturally convergent, right? Because these issues are all about the same. It's about food security. It's about how to manage our food systems to be more resilient, less vulnerable to disruptions, how to advance towards this transition that our food systems need to overcome, because changes are happening, things are happening. And I was really surprised to see how Kushank's work, for instance, was on the needs for fruits and vegetables, right? What do we do? Should we produce or not? And this is one of the main inputs for research on vertical farming. We need to know what to produce, what to sell, what is marketable, and what is profitable. What are the needs? So this is definitely aligned. Also, Luter's work, I believe, is completely aligned with the implementation not only of vertical farming, but of modern technologies to address sustainability matters in food systems, because we need to understand that the vision should not only be about reducing local and domestic CO2 emissions. We're all, as a planet, going towards the same pathway, and we need to ensure that from a life cycle perspective, we really achieve reductions in terms of CO2 emissions. But there are implications, policy implications, prices, affordability that may be compromised with these considerations. And also, Melat's work is absolutely relevant for the implementation of any new technologies, because we're not only speaking about implementing these technologies in cities where people may be likely to accept and get involved in in the implementation of these technologies, but we're also speaking about the need for supplying fresh fruits and vegetables and fresh food to remote regions, to remote areas, to indigenous populations, to different populations with different needs. So I believe our work is naturally aligned, and I'm looking forward to see what we can do in this second stage of CAPI.
Yep, and we're looking forward to year two in your group project. Melat, your thoughts on common themes that come out across the papers?
Yeah, so a common theme that came up across the papers for me is the importance of context and recognizing the circumstances in each province. I think each paper highlighted it's important to understand the context of the region, of the province, whether it being vertical farming, understanding the context of the region, supply chain, which regions are the least and the most vulnerable in which aspect. So the importance of tailoring policies, programs, interventions, in particular to a specific region in any context. That's a common theme.
That's certainly again I think one of the common themes that I'm taking across is that again that these really are really complex issues, and that context and those different dynamics is important. Kushank, were there themes that came out for you? Or you're muted, Kushank.
Sorry, I think the trade-offs was a big one, and putting things in context. We have a lot of different solutions from all the way from policy, from CBA to vertical farming to behavioral insights to actually encourage adoption of practices and technologies. But it's going to be context specificity and the trade-offs part, I think, which always came out for me. And how do we put those interventions in those contexts and try to manage those trade-offs?
Sure. And Luter, your thoughts on common themes?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's about the sustainable supply chain, which is something that Kushank and Carolina dealt with, and it is possible to see how this can benefit from a border carbon adjustment regime, because products produced sustainably would definitely benefit in those kind of regimes if adopted widely, because they will not suffer any cost potential or they'll suffer less cost related to other products in terms of application of border carbon adjustment. And that work was very, very instructive in terms of the kind of dialogue that we need to take at the international level to secure the buy-in of various trading partners, how to approach it in a way. So while she discussed it in local context, it is also very relevant at international context, because often achieving global consensus can be extremely difficult. We saw that with the long road to the Paris Accord. So, but there are strategies from which we can draw insights from our work to see how we can deploy strategies in diplomacy to achieve that kind of global consensus. So it's all aligned, and I see how we can actually. I'm very upbeat about the joint progress project that will be undertaken.
Yeah, hopefully it will be easier for you all to find consensus next year than it has been to find some of that global consensus so far. We haven't had a chance. We won't be able to get to some of the specific questions, so we'll try and get back to our audience members with answers to those. But one last question that we'll go back again to a roundtable on, and it's I think hopefully a really simple question, but a really important one. What is one single policy recommendation that you'll give based on the research project that you've done for decision makers? But if there's one key recommendation that our audience should take away with them today related to your work. So Carolina, why don't we start with you?
Tyler, I would speak about convergence of efforts, of stakeholders, of academia, of universities, of work. I mean, I believe vertical farming, for instance, is worth further research, but I also believe there are many facilities around that may be good scenarios for research instead of constructing new venues to do research. So this multifunctionality lens that I'm speaking about may be maybe based on a research from an existing venue that may be accommodated for multiple crops, and then we can do some research. And also, profitability is at the center of these technologies. That's important for producers. This is something that has to be viable, that has to be feasible, and sometimes as researchers, we tend to go to ideal scenarios, right? Where circular economy works, where everything works, but in real life, there's challenges. So we need to work hand in hand with the government and with producers to attain research that is relevant to reality and to find solutions that are viable and that are feasible.
Great. Thank you. Kushank, one recommendation?
If policymakers wants to ensure Canadians have access to affordable and sufficient fruits and vegetables, healthy diets, I believe we need to sustainably increase our domestic production of fruits and vegetables. This can be done by supporting small-scale farmers. This can be done by incentivizing farmers to transition to greenhouses, even in fact, vertical farming in northern parts of BC or in remote regions. But it's about having flexible interventions or solutions that are based on ground up methodologies and not having one solution fits all solutions.
Great, thank you. Melat, one recommendation?
My recommendation would be to do randomized control trials, so pilot projects for policy, and for any policy or program, and it doesn't have to be a big one. It could be how trying out between two different groups, a longer and a shorter contract, a different type of framings, or different amount of incentives. So it can be a simple one, but run these experiments to see which resonates more with the region. So that's my.
Great, thank you. And Nute, one recommendation from you for policymakers.
I think it would be to trust innovation and support it. I think regulation alone has hardly achieved much. We have seen that innovation always comes through to make things easier, sometimes even in the absence of regulation. We're seeing this success not just in terms of in the context of environmental protection measures, or software, in intellectual property, in various aspects. Innovation has been the solution. So I think it's to look at the kind of concepts that are coming up. Some of them are big in financing, some of them are taking some kind of support in one way or the other. I think the government of Canada, as Canada being one of the largest fertilizer exporters, should be very interested in supporting and being ahead in terms of innovation for clean ammonia or clean fertilizer production. As I discussed earlier, we're already seeing this kind of thing, the developments in the UK and Norway, in the US, by fertilizer companies that also have operations in Canada. So, the question is, why not Canada, right? So I think there should be support that should help, but policymakers should also pay attention to the kind of controversies that those supports will generate. It is likely that they would be taken up as issues of subsidies, and again, dialogue would be essential to create policy space for that kind of support being seen broadly and internationally as necessary.
Right. Thank you. And thank you to all four of our doctoral fellows for their presentations, the dialogue this morning, and for the research reports. Please do check them out. We'd also like to thank their advisors that supported them throughout this project. And of course, RBC and the RBC Tech For Nature initiative for supporting the fellows. We look forward to seeing what our fellows do together next year for their group project. So look forward to seeing that. Stay tuned, sign up for the CAPI email list to hear more. And please do fill out the survey that will be sent out after the webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.